Okay, so our topic for tonight, conscious care for our body, part one. So we're looking at a sense of well-being, and if you mute your mics for now. So well-being, you can say when there's a sense of well-being, body-wise, as a chiropractor, we recognize the alignment of the spine. This here are muscles, the tone of the muscles, the nerves getting through the body the way they should, the body's symmetrical, where legs are even in length. And then something that I've become more aware of through working with HeartMath is that our heart needs to be beating in its proper rhythms. And our heart has been known, actually they can measure it now, to extend a field out from our physical body. And when that field is extending out, there's a sense of well-being. And you think about what we're looking to do, experience with conscious healthy aging is to have a sense of well-being where we feel functional, we feel clear-headed, we feel capable, we feel like life is great no matter what age we are. So that's the big idea, well-being. But when things come along, stresses like trauma or toxins and thoughts, so you can say centrally, we recognize these are kind of the underlying kingpins for physical dis-ease, where there's a sense of at ease. And what happens is that field begins to shrink. I call it the raisin effect. You can say our heart rhythms get thrown off, our muscles begin to get tense, and that can turn bones, vertebrae out of place. One leg can become shorter. You can say, and that becomes the raisin effect. So we want to see what it takes to shift from having a raisin. Remember the commercial sun-made raisins? So we're going to be looking to see how we can make raisins-made suns. And part of that process is looking at assessments, blood, hair, urine, et cetera, to see where we are objectively, and then seeing what it takes to move in a healthy direction. If we've had certain traumas and we have certain, say, joint conditions, what it takes to actually move in a way that where things can begin to actually feel better at least. And part of that relates to having some care that balances our body. And as a chiropractor, I recommend folks, I see them on a periodic basis to help with that. But there's other forms of balancing the body in that respect. Then lifestyle. Now, ideally my work is to help restore a balance, but ideally it's for each of us to see what it takes in our lifestyle to choose what it takes to maintain that balance. And then natural support. Natural support can be in the form of supplementation, technology to help all along with this. So along with that, we want to see, again, we've been focusing on the purpose, our reason for being. And reason why I acknowledging our reason for being in alignment with that, because it gives us a why, the leverage of why we want to be healthy, so we can carry through with making the right lifestyle choices, supplement choices, or finding ways to engage with balancing our body here. So the idea here is we want to keep in a generative state. And when we're not generating something, if we're not actually in a healthy well-being mode, you can say we're dissipating. And we can't be dissipating and generating at the same time. It's one or the other. So you want to see what it takes to correct certain things in our life so that instead of dissipating certain times, taking note of that, it changes. So we're not all bent out of shape, basically. So we actually begin to be consistently in a generative, you can say a life extending mode rather than in a contracting mode where we feel like things are collapsing in on us. Okay, so lifestyle choices. We'll look at these a little bit more in depth. So here we are, our choices of posture, how we breathe, what we eat and drink, fitness, rest, activity, balance. And you can say with posture, posture relates to our attitudinal thinking and feeling. So just, when you erect yourself upright, you put yourself in a more commanding position, you can say in attitude. So there's a little posture exercise I do every morning, standing against the wall with my shoulders against it, my head against the wall there, and just to upright myself and feel that sense of confidence to start my day. Breathing has a lot to do with stress, and then with HeartMath, or you most likely have come across certain breathing exercises that help with that, that help bring poise to the body. eating and drinking. So ideally we want to eat as much real food, less processed foods, and having adequate clean hydration, along with being consciously mindful of eating, taking a pause. Carol and myself, while we're eating, we usually pause for a moment to say a prayer or a blessing to help assist. So those are two central things I take note of, but there's a whole lot with diet. But again, keeping things simple, I narrowed it down to those two things to really take note of. Fitness. Now, fitness, we want to look for having cardio exercise, strength training, stretching, contralateral movement. A contralateral movement is when you walk, you're using opposite leg, opposite arm motion, or when you run, or even with swimming. So actually contralateral movement helps the nervous system to integrate. Okay, now we'll find out a little bit more next month there about our genetics. Sometimes, our genetics can tell us whether we have a little more favor to have our body do strength training or resistance training over cardio, or some of us might be more designed to do more cardio over strength training, but you want to look to integrate both. And simply, fitness, you want to get some movement, walk, dance, garden, etc. And a big thing too is getting outside. Getting outside, we talked about soft fascination, appreciating nature, but there's something with full spectrum sunlight too. When you get outside, I advise folks at times to take their glasses off there and to look up towards the sky, because what happens there, the full spectrum light, not looking directly at the sun, but the full spectrum light that's outside actually has an influence on our retina, which then the sunlight hitting our retina influences our pineal gland, and in turn our pineal gland can activate our pituitary gland, which then springboards everything else within our system. But the biggest thing I see with lifestyle is this here, the flow state. Out of everything, I feel like this is the most central key for all of us to pay attention to in terms of our physical bodily health, as well as our mental and emotional health. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail. So our conscious flow state, we want to see activity, the balance of our activity, and our rest and recovery. So when we have a certain flow state, there's a sense of presence, a sense of ease. But when we're getting out of the flow state, we're squeezing, there's a sense of anxiety, we're trying to get things done, we're multitasking, we got to get things done so we have time later, but later never comes because we're always getting things done. And then life becomes a struggle, we're over-amping ourselves. And then on the other spectrum there, if we're not doing enough, where there's a sense of boredom or something missing, where we're not taking on enough, where when we have that sense, we need to see, okay, what can I do a little bit more to get into the flow state? So it needs to be that balance of activity and rest. If we're also in this range here, the past may matter most to us, and then we might be entangled with personal worldly matters that actually drag us down into a lowered functional energetic state. So here in the flow state, we want to think about containment, calibrating our own energy cadence. So for some of us, we might have more energy to stay in the flow state. Some of us, we may have to calibrate. We recognize we have a certain energy reserve that we may not be able to do as much as someone else, but we find our own cadence in that respect. And then when we do find that flow, then there's a sense of meaningfulness. There's not a struggle. And then a sense of ingenuousness, like something does dawn, that seventh sense opens up. But it all starts in our heart. When our heart is actually oriented, there's a compass in our heart where we have a sense of what's important, what's not. It allows us to begin to calibrate and be contained in that flow state. So let me show you this next slide. The next slide is a little bit blurry, but I have some things to add to it, which goes along with this. So they call it the flow cycle, and it's derived from this Flow Research Collective. So what happens here is when we're struggling, we're in a state of what's called stuck in beta brain waves. Now, if you're not familiar with brain waves, there's certain frequencies in that respect. So when we're stuck in brain waves in terms of we're struggling with something, we're trying to get something done, we're just on the go all the time, our cortisol levels raise, our norepinephrine levels raise, and we're kind of just stuck in that mode. But we want to see what it takes to begin to have more or less of an aha experience where we say, okay, let's stop here. Let me start to realize more what needs to be done with my pace. And that's where what's called alpha waves kick in. And nitric oxide is released. Nitric oxide helps to relax the blood vessels, opens things up. And this is when we find a conscious flow in our daily living, where there's a sense of sequence. We're beginning to calibrate. We're less overemptying, more intensity if we need to. We're finding a conscious flow in our daily living. And then when we find that flow, it leads to something called theta and gamma waves, where it allows for dopamine and endorphins. You know, endorphins are endogenous, you can say morphine effect, where we have a sense of, wow, this really feels good. And that's when we engage in total presence activities. It could be a music, art, nature, conversation. Now, Ray's not here tonight. He does drumming there in a band, but when we're in an activity that totally absorbs us and we're not thinking about nothing else comes to mind, that's when it opens up these theta and gamma waves. And like there's no other place we want to be except in that activity. And then allowing, again, for recovery, where it engages something called delta waves, delta brain waves. And that's when serotonin, oxytocin are kicked in. And that relates to a regenerative rest and relaxation, forms of endearment, hugs, touch, spiritual communion. You know, it allows for that. And we need to see how we can engage with that and in balancing ways with all of these. You know, in our daily living of flow, we need to see how we can not get stuck in beta waves, you know, finding the activities that totally absorb our attention, where we're totally present, and then finding ways of relaxation and recovery. So there's flow states. Now there's a term called eudaimonia, which stems back to Greek times. And this is kind of derived from conversations that Aristotle, Plato, Socrates had, but it was updated by this statement: well-being is not so much an outcome or an end state, as it is a process of fulfilling or realizing one's daimon, spirit or true nature. That is, of fulfilling one's virtuous potentials and living as one was inherently intended to live. Let me just read that again. Well-being is not so much an outcome or end state, as it is a process of fulfilling or realizing one's daimon, spirit or true nature. That is, of fulfilling one's virtuous potentials and living as one was inherently intended to live. And that was coined by psychologists DC and Ryan in 2006. But it stems way back to ancient times as well as relative times. And I think we can all relate to that. When we find a flow state, consciously and living, or even that theta state, there's a sense of well-being. Eudaimonia means good spirit, a sense of well-being. Okay, let's let this kind of sink in a little bit. And so we'll have a meditation here. So, you know, hand on our heart. We'll look to sit upright there. And then actually you can put one hand over your heart, your left hand over your heart, and your right hand over your solar plexus, which is just below your rib cage in the center. And then, you know, if you want to close your eyes, and then imagine breathing in through your heart as you breathe in, and then breathe out through your solar plexus. And breathing in through your heart, and out through your solar plexus. Continue along those lines on your own. And begin to relax and letting those alpha waves be kicked in, letting nitric oxide begin to dilate your blood vessels, letting a little just relaxation come as you breathe in, as you breathe out. Let's still our hearts and our minds, appreciating the bodies that we do have. We only have our one body, and to really appreciate it. And opening up to how we can consciously care for it in terms of what we eat, how we exercise, how we handle stress, but ideally finding a flow state. Open up to see how you can find a flow state. Let a realization come. A greater flow state. Relax your shoulders, let them drop. Breathing in, breathing out. In the stillness of this moment, we give thanks for our bodies with deep thanks and gratefulness. And as our hearts are positioned this way, we allow for a seed to be planted. So there's a greater realization of how we can care for our bodies. For we only have one body. As we hold this stillness, we feel whole and complete and open. Open for our next phase of deciding and discerning, and we'll look to see now how we can articulate that individually. So we'll open our eyes and continue on. And if you have a piece of paper, how will you care for your body? How I will care for my body. So if you want to write something down, hopefully you have something to write on. Let's take a moment individually to articulate something in that respect. We're all ready. We can consider our thoughts, questions, comments, see what you think.